uninvited. There is a difference between thoughts we choose and thoughts that choose us. The first are like letters we write. The second are like strangers who knock at our door in the middle of the night. Intrusive thoughts arrive unannounced, unwelcome, and often unwanted. They slip through the cracks of consciousness like smoke through an open window. One moment the mind is clear. The next, it is filled with images, words, or scenarios that feel foreign to our very nature. An ancient teaching whispers, "The mind is like a house with many rooms. Some guests are invited, others simply appear." The question is not how to bar all doors, but how to respond when the uninvited arrive. The lighthouse keeper's dilemma. A lighthouse keeper lived alone on a rocky island. Each night he would light the beacon to guide ships safely to shore. His days were peaceful, his purpose clear. But one evening, strange visitors began appearing at his door. They wore the faces of his deepest fears. What if he forgot to light the beacon? What if ships crashed because of his negligence? What if he was responsible for disasters that had never happened? These visitors spoke in his own voice, used his own words, yet felt completely alien. They showed him vivid pictures of catastrophes, played out scenarios of failure, and whispered doubts about his competence. The keeper tried to argue with them, to prove them wrong, to push them away. But the more he engaged, the more real they became. The more he fought, the stronger they grew. One night, exhausted from battle, he simply sat in his chair and watched them. He noticed something profound. They were like shadows cast by his lighthouse beam. The brighter his dedication to his duty, the darker the shadows of what if became. The shadows existed because the light existed. They were not separate from his care. They were its inverse reflection. Teaching. Intrusive thoughts often arise from our deepest values. The mind that cares deeply about safety generates fears of causing harm. The mind that values love conjures scenarios of rejection. They are not signs of our darkness, but distorted reflections of our light. The garden of weeds. A gardener tended a beautiful garden with great devotion. She planted seeds of kindness, watered them with attention, and watched them grow into flowers of joy and peace. But one season, strange weeds began appearing overnight. These were not ordinary weeds. They were thoughts that took root without permission. Some showed her images of violence she would never commit. Others whispered words of hatred toward people she loved. Still others played out scenarios of self-destruction that felt completely foreign to her nature. The gardener was horrified. "These are not my plants," she cried. "I never planted these seeds. They don't belong in my garden." She began pulling them frantically, spending hours each day trying to remove every unwanted growth. But the more she pulled, the more they seemed to multiply. Her beautiful garden became a battlefield. An old gardener passed by and saw her struggle. "What are you fighting?" he asked. "These terrible weeds," she replied. "They're not mine. They don't belong here." The old gardener smiled gently. "Child, do you control the wind that carries seeds? Do you govern the rain that falls? A garden receives all manner of seeds, some from your hand, some from the sky, some from places unknown. The art is not in controlling what arrives, but in choosing what to nurture." He showed her a different way. Acknowledge the weeds, neither fighting them nor feeding them, but simply tending to the flowers she had chosen to grow. Over time, the weeds that received no attention withered, while the flowers that received her care flourished. Teaching. Intrusive thoughts are like seeds blown by winds we cannot control. We do not choose what lands in the garden of our mind, but we can choose what we water with our attention. The radio of the mind. A traveler inherited an old radio from his grandfather. Most days it played beautiful music that filled his heart with peace. But sometimes, without warning, the radio would pick up strange transmissions. These were not the stations he had tuned to. They were foreign broadcasts speaking of violence, disaster, and despair. The voice sounded like his own, but the words felt utterly alien. The images they painted were vivid and disturbing. At first he thought the radio was broken. He shook it, adjusted the antenna, and tried different settings. But the strange transmissions persisted. He brought it to a repair shop. The technician examined it carefully and said, "There's nothing wrong with your radio. It's simply sensitive. Sometimes it picks up distant signals. Emergency broadcasts, test transmissions, even signals bouncing off the atmosphere from far away. These aren't your stations, but your radio is sensitive enough to receive them. The traveler learned to understand the difference between the music he chose and the static he received. When strange transmissions came through, he neither panicked nor fought with the radio. He simply adjusted his attention, returning to the stations that nourished his soul. Teaching. A sensitive mind, like a sensitive radio, may pick up thoughts that are not its own. This sensitivity is not a flaw, it is often a gift. The practice is learning to distinguish between what we tune into and what simply passes through. If this message resonates with you, and you're seeking more moments of peace and insight, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for daily reflections rooted in ancient wisdom and modern clarity. The Security Guard's Awakening. A security guard worked at a museum filled with priceless art. His job was to protect the treasures. It showed him detailed scenarios of how he might damage the artwork, how he might fail in his duty, how he might become the very danger he was meant to guard against. These thoughts felt like intrusions into his consciousness. They were vivid, persistent, and completely contrary to his values. The more he tried to suppress them, the more urgent they became. He began to question his own character. Am I the kind of person who would harm these treasures? Why is my mind showing me these terrible scenarios? An old curator, noticing his distress, sat with him during a quiet moment. "You know," she said, "the most sensitive security systems are often the most prone to false alarms. The system that can detect the smallest threat sometimes mistakes a falling leaf for an intruder." She continued, "Your mind is like that sensitive system. It generates scenarios not because you want to harm, but because you care so deeply about protecting. It's showing you what you fear most, not what you desire most." The guard learned to see his intrusive thoughts as false alarms from an overly sensitive security system. When they arose, he would acknowledge them. "Thank you, mind, for trying to protect what I value. But this is a false alarm. I can return to my actual duty now." Teaching. Intrusive thoughts often arise from our deepest values, not our hidden desires. The mind that cares about safety generates fears of causing harm. The mind that values love conjures fears of rejection. They are false alarms from an overly protective system. The artist's canvas. An artist sat before a blank canvas, brush in hand, ready to create something beautiful. But as she prepared to paint, strange images began appearing on the canvas without her consent. These were not the gentle landscapes she intended to paint. They were disturbing scenes that seemed to emerge from somewhere beyond her conscious mind. The brush moved as if guided by another hand, creating images that horrified her. She tried to paint over them, but they kept bleeding through. She tried to focus, harder on her intended image, but the unwanted visions grew stronger with her resistance. Finally, exhausted, she set down her brush and simply observed what was happening. She noticed that the strange images were not actually on the canvas. They were projections of her mind, like shadows cast by her fears onto the blank surface. When she stopped fighting the projections and simply returned her attention to the physical brush, the physical paint, the physical canvas, the unwanted images began to fade. They had no substance without her struggle against them. She learned to distinguish between the creations of her conscious intent and the shadows cast by her fears. Both might appear on the canvas of her mind, but only one came from her true artistic will. Teaching. Intrusive thoughts are like unwanted projections on the canvas of consciousness. They seem real and vivid, but they have no substance without our struggle against them. The practice is returning to what we actually choose to create. The Night Watchman's Wisdom. A night watchman patrolled an empty building, walking the same halls hour after hour. The building was safe, but in the quiet darkness, his mind began creating its own disturbances. He would hear footsteps that weren't there, see shadows that held no substance, and imagine intruders in every corner. These mental intrusions felt as real as any physical threat. At first, he would investigate every phantom sound, check every imagined threat, but this only made the false alarms more frequent and more convincing. An experienced watchman, hearing of his struggle, shared an insight. In the deep quiet, the mind creates its own noise. In the perfect safety, it conjures its own threats. This is not a sign of danger. It is a sign of how vigilant your mind has become. He taught the younger watchman a different approach. When you hear the phantom footsteps, acknowledge them. I hear you, mind. When you see the shadow figures, nod to them. I see you, fear. But do not investigate what is not there. Teaching. In the quiet spaces of life, the mind often creates its own disturbances. These mental phantoms require acknowledgement, but not investigation. The practice is distinguishing between actual duties and imagined threats. The river's teaching. A monk lived in quiet solitude beside a wide, winding river that flowed gently past his humble monastery. Each morning before the sun crested the hills, he would make his way to the riverbank and sit cross-legged on a smooth, time-worn stone. There he would close his eyes, breathe deeply, and listen to the soft murmur of water moving over stones, letting the rhythm of the river anchor his awareness. This river, he had come to realize, was a teacher. Day after day he observed it, sometimes sparkling and tranquil, other times murky and chaotic. On clear days he could see fish darting in the shallows, pebbles resting peacefully at the bottom, but not every day was so serene. After storms or strong winds, the current would carry fallen branches, dead leaves, and even bits of trash discarded from far upstream. The monk noticed how this debris behaved. Some objects simply drifted by, carried effortlessly by the current, never disturbing the water's harmony. But others would snag on, submerged rocks or branches, caught in eddies and whirlpools, spinning and churning, disturbing the clarity of the river. One morning, as he watched a large clump of branches twist in a swirling vortex, he felt a familiar tightness in his chest. A sudden anxious thought had arisen in his mind, unbidden and unwanted. Then another thought, harsh and self-critical, followed it like a shadow. He had not invited these thoughts, nor did he want them, but there they were, disrupting his inner stillness. It was then he saw it, the parallel between the river and his mind. Like the river, his consciousness was in constant motion, a flowing stream of sensations, memories, images and thoughts. Most thoughts passed harmlessly, like clouds drifting through a vast sky or water gliding over stone. But every so often, a particularly disturbing or intrusive thought would appear, like debris from some unseen source far upstream. At first, his instinct was to react. He would try to grab the thought, analyze it, control it, or push it away. But the more he struggled, the more agitated he became, like reaching into the river to forcefully remove the debris, only to create turbulence that clouded the water even more. He realized that his resistance itself was the source of the disturbance. He remembered how the river remained most peaceful when it was allowed to flow. When he didn't interfere, the debris simply moved on. It didn't linger. It didn't define the river. It was just passing through. And so he began to train his mind in the same way. When a disturbing thought arose, he would notice it without judgment. He would not call it good or bad, right or wrong. He would not claim it as his own, nor try to make it vanish. Instead, he would let it be, observing its arrival, its presence, and its eventual departure. Over time, he noticed that these thoughts began to lose their power. Like leaves floating on the surface of the river, they came and went, leaving no lasting trace. The river of his mind remained clear and undisturbed, not because there was no debris, but because he had stopped clinging to it. The monk came to understand a profound truth. Not every thought that arises belongs to us. Some are echoes from the past, some are conditioned patterns, some are mere noise carried by the winds of the world. Our suffering arises not from the presence of these thoughts, but from our mistaken belief that we must act on them, fight them, or become them. And so he lived day by day beside the river that mirrored his mind, allowing the stream to flow, the debris to pass, and peace to settle where resistance once lived. Teaching. Intrusive thoughts are like debris in the river of consciousness, not ours but present. The practice is allowing them to flow past without grasping or pushing, trusting in the natural current of awareness. The doctor's dilemma. There was once a doctor who had devoted her entire life to the service of others. From the moment she stepped into medical school, she had felt a deep and unwavering sense of purpose. Healing, for her, was not just a profession, it was a calling. She treated each patient not as a case but as a human being carrying stories, pain, and hope within them. She listened deeply. She studied tirelessly. She held hands, gave difficult news with softness, and celebrated small victories with quiet joy. Her compassion was her compass, and her skill only deepened its direction. But over time, something began to change. In the stillness between appointments, or in the silence of her own thoughts late at night, strange and disturbing images began to emerge in her mind. They arrived like sudden storms on an otherwise calm horizon, unwelcome, vivid, and sharp. She would be preparing a syringe in her imagination, and the thought would flash, "What if you gave the wrong dose?" She'd be walking into a patient's room and suddenly envision causing harm instead of help. Her own inner voice began whispering dark suggestions she would never act upon, portraying mistakes, accidents, or even deliberate cruelty. At first, she was horrified. Where did this come from? She had never been anything but careful, compassionate, and precise. Yet here were thoughts that seemed to contradict everything she stood for. The more she resisted them, the louder they became. The more she questioned herself, the more her mind invented new scenarios. She began to feel trapped in a secret war no one else could see. These thoughts didn't feel like her, but they used her voice, her fears, her love for her patients as fuel. They struck at the core of her identity, shaking her confidence not just in her profession, but in herself as a human being. She began to pull back, doubting her worth, her safety, her role. Was she unfit to practice? Was there something broken within her? Sensing her distress, an old mentor, now retired but once her teacher, invited her to speak. In the quiet of his study, surrounded by old books and warm tea, she finally poured her heart out. Tears filled her eyes as she said, "I don't understand. I've never wanted to harm anyone. But my mind shows me these terrible things. What kind of doctor, what kind of person does that make me?" The mentor listened without interruption. His face was kind, weathered by years, and his presence calm like a deep lake. Then he said gently, "Let me tell you something few ever say aloud. The mind that cares deeply about healing will often generate fears of causing harm. The heart that loves with sincerity will imagine being the cause of pain or rejection. These thoughts do not arise because you are dangerous or broken. They arise because you care. They are shadows cast by the very light within you." She looked at him, stunned. "But they feel so real." "They always do," he nodded. "The more we love, the more our mind wants to protect that love. And so it searches, sometimes obsessively, for any potential threat, even ones that don't exist. And when it cannot find a threat outside, it invents one inside. That is the cost of your deep responsibility and your open heart. Your thoughts are not evidence of danger. They are false alarms triggered by the weight of your own compassion." A silence settled over the room. But it wasn't empty. It was full of understanding. Over the weeks and months that followed, she began to change how she related to her thoughts. No longer did she see them as signs of hidden darkness, but as reflections of how much she cared. When a disturbing image would flash through her mind, she would place a hand on her heart and think, "This thought is not me. It is a ripple in the water, not the ocean itself. It arises because I care so deeply about doing no harm. It is a false alarm from a loving heart." She stopped trying to fight or suppress the thoughts. She observed them with clarity, named them without judgment, and let them pass, and they began to loosen their grip. In time, her inner peace returned, not because the thoughts vanished completely, but because they no longer held power over her. She had reclaimed her identity not in spite of those thoughts, but by understanding them. And so she continued her work, with even greater empathy than before. She knew now that true strength was not the absence of doubt, but the courage to meet it with honesty and love. She healed not only others but herself, and her mind, once a battlefield, became once more a sanctuary of care. Teaching. Intrusive thoughts often attack what we care about most. They are not evidence of our true nature, but distortions of our deepest values. The practice is recognizing them as false alarms from a caring heart. The integration. These stories weave together a deeper understanding. Intrusive thoughts are not intruders to be battled, but phenomena to be understood. They arise from sensitivity, not pathology. They reflect our values, not our corruption. They demand awareness, not warfare. The practice of working with intrusive thoughts contains several key elements. Recognition, understanding that these thoughts are not chosen, not reflective of character, and not requiring action. Acceptance, allowing them to be present, without fighting or feeding them. Redirection, gently returning attention to chosen activities and values. Compassion, treating ourselves with kindness when these mental visitors arrive. Perspective, seeing intrusive thoughts as evidence of sensitivity and care, not signs of danger or dysfunction. The path through intrusive thoughts is not about elimination, but about relationship. We learn to coexist with the uninvited visitors of the mind, neither hosting them nor banishing them, but simply allowing them to pass through the vast space of awareness. In this space, we discover that we are not our thoughts. We are the awareness that witnesses them. We are not the content of the mind. We are the consciousness that observes it. We are not the storm. We are the sky that holds it. The uninvited visitors may come and go, but the sky remains unchanging, unlimited, and free. A practice for the path. If you seek to walk this path of understanding, begin gently. Morning awareness. Each day remind yourself that you are not your thoughts, but the awareness that observes them. Naming. When intrusive thoughts arise, simply note, intrusive thought, and return to your present activity. Compassion. Treat yourself with the same kindness you would offer a friend experiencing these mental visitors. Values. Clarification. Remember that these thoughts often attack what you care about most. They are distortions of your values, not reflections of your character. Professional support. If intrusive thoughts significantly impact your life, consider working with a therapist trained in approaches like acceptance and commitment therapy or exposure and response prevention. The journey through intrusive thoughts is not about achieving a perfect mind, but about developing a wise relationship with an imperfect one. In this relationship, we find not the elimination of mental visitors, but the freedom to remain unmoved by their arrival. The temple of the mind has many rooms. Some guests are invited, others simply appear. But the host, the aware, compassionate witness, remains present through all visits, offering neither resistance nor hospitality, but simply the spacious awareness that allows all experiences to arise and pass away. In this awareness, we find our freedom, not from the mind, but within it, not through perfection, but through acceptance, not by becoming someone else, but by remembering who we have always been beneath the changing weather of thought. The uninvited visitors may knock, but the house of awareness has infinite space. Let them enter, let them pass, and return always to the peaceful host who watches it all with loving eyes. Thank you for taking this journey through the landscape of intrusive thoughts. Remember, you are not alone in this experience, and these mental visitors do not define your character or your worth. In the vast sky of awareness, all weather is temporary, but the sky itself remains eternal and free.